Okay, so today we're going to be talking about intellectual property, which is the right to produce as a monopolist for a period of time. And this takes many forms. Copyrights. Yeah, Dave. Okay. This includes copyrights and patents, which are the two most well-known formal forms of intellectual property, as well as trade secrets, which firms might keep, which are an alternative to formal intellectual property protection, secrets about how to make their product, as well as what I call authenticity rents, which are not formal intellectual property, but where consumers might be willing to pay more for the original version of something, even though they could get just as good of a fake version. Art is a classic example of that, but a lot of fashion is that way as well. And intellectual property, I think, is one of the oldest forms of economic policy. So I have a quote that I found with a classicist that's published on the back cover of one of the issues of the Journal of Political Economy, the in-house journal here at Chicago. And it is from a Greek historian saying that in 7th century BC Greeks, they used to offer that if you came up with a really great dish, you would be the only person who would have the right to cook that dish for the next year. And today we're going to learn about the trade-offs involved in intellectual property, and we'll relate it a bit to the punishment of crime. So we'll start by talking about what monopoly profits incentivize, about the creative destruction that accompanies dynamic markets and the role that that plays in economic development. We'll relate this to the static and dynamic effects of crime, and then talk about the importance of incentives to motivate innovation, as well as the harms associated with intellectual property. And that will lead us to a trade-off between innovation incentives and the distortions that accompany intellectual property. We'll then use that to develop a model of optimal intellectual property and go through some comparative statics of that, as well as the lessons that it teaches for policy, and then briefly discuss some of the broader perspectives on issues related to intellectual property other than this basic simple trade-off. Okay, so thus far we've viewed monopoly profits as being just a transfer. That is, we thought that the harm of monopoly was not the profits that the firm earned, but the deadweight loss. And while a redistributive motive might lead us to oppose these types of transfers, I think a more important factor in thinking about the status of the monopoly profit is the encouragement that monopoly profits give to certain activities. Now, sometimes the monopoly profit really is just a rent to whoever ends up collecting it, but often monopoly profits actually act as a way to incentivize people to undertake activities that they wouldn't undertake in the absence of that rent. And these activities could be pure rent seeking, in which case they would be wasteful, like lobbying for protection. And in this case, the monopoly profits are themselves a social waste, because rather than just being a rent, a transfer to the monopolist, they end up getting dissipated. People end up spending enough to try to achieve them through lobbying, and if that lobbying is wasteful, then market power is harmful. And that makes monopoly much more harmful than in the standard analysis, because not only the deadweight loss, but also the profit need to be counted as waste. On the other hand, monopoly rents could encourage the creation of a new market. And because the monopolist who creates that new market only gets the benefit of the profits and not of the consumer surplus that that new market also creates, creating those markets will itself have an entrepreneurial externality. And that will make the monopoly profits not just a transfer, but actually a benefit because of the consumer surplus that they bring about. Yes, well.
Yeah, why is the profits are definitely lost? Is it just the money they spend on rent seeking?
Well, yeah, the point is that the money that they spend on rent seeking will generate some profits for them, but those profits won't compensate for all, they'll compensate for the waste that they created, but that waste is social loss to society.
So the waste is social loss, but the profits otherwise would have been?
They would have been, but the thing is that their existence encouraged this wasteful activity. So, I mean, that's a more general thing. Like, if people are getting rewarded for something that doesn't have much social value, you should be worried, because then they're going to spend a lot of time trying to get that reward, and that's going to turn that transfer into waste. I think that's one reason why a lot of people are concerned about Wall Street, is that, all the money that you can make there, if you don't think it's all doing that much social value, is going to encourage a lot of people to go into that area who could otherwise be doing productive activities. And this makes monopoly far better than the standard analysis if it's incentivizing the creation of new markets. Okay, and all of this, I think, can be crucial in many cases because the profits that a monopolist creates can be much larger than deadweight loss. That can be true in many classic monopoly settings when the profit square is bigger than the deadweight loss triangle. But more importantly, when we turn to oligopoly and there isn't as much deadweight loss because the price gets lowered and the deadweight loss is a triangle, right? So as the price goes towards the efficient price, the deadweight loss triangle is going to be very small, but the profit area is still significant because it's a rectangle rather than a triangle. So imagine that we were to lower this price down. The deadweight loss would start to shrink significantly, but the profit area would still would still be significant. Okay. So we've talked before about some of the ways of obtaining monopoly. Let me refresh you on some of those. So one is protection by a government. For example, licensure, chartered corporations in history, like the East India Company, was chartered to be a monopoly by the government. And these can be useful to some extent for a country if it's exporting or importing from a foreign country, because they actually want to exploit that other country to gain as much value as they can from that other country, and them putting a monopoly in charge of it might accomplish that goal. Private or illegal violence is another way of obtaining monopoly. So mafias control lots of industries, especially illegal industries, and also sort of semi-legal industries like casinos. And exclusionary practices, like we discussed in the beer market in Peru, can be another way of gaining monopoly power. Another form is illegal cartels in legal industries. And antitrust laws are designed to prevent these, but they didn't really exist in Europe prior to the 1980s, and in many developing countries they are weak. And even in countries where they exist, cartels can still form. So for example, there's a movie with Matt Damon that I'm trying to remember what it's called, maybe something like The Insider. What?
Gasland?
No. The Informant. It might be The Informant. Yeah. And it's about the vitamin cartel in the United States.
Well, that was about it was something about corn.
It was about corn?
Yeah,
I thought it was about the vitamin cartel, but it might have been the corn cartel. Anyways, it's about some cartel. You can figure it out maybe online, yeah. Mergers are another way of forming monopolies. Governments try to review these and to stop them from forming monopolies. but some countries don't, I mean, they don't get everything, and also in some countries there is no merger policy. So for example, in Peru, the way that the cartel, basically, or legal cartel of beer formed there was that Americans, they opened up to investment with the United States, and the United States companies, in particular SAB Miller, came and bought up all the brands of beer in Peru, and they had no merger control, so that was perfectly legal. Intellectual property is another form that we'll talk about in just a minute. Okay, so each of these forms of monopoly and the profits that come along with them encourage some activity beyond just whatever distortion the monopoly creates in static terms. And Mike, what are some of the things that would be encouraged by each of these types of monopoly we talked about before?
You would have exclusive access to markets. Maybe if you could do a thing like buy out all the beer companies, then maybe that person could sell beer.
But what would, okay, so that's the consequence. But the fact that you can make profits off of that, what types of activities does that encourage in each of the examples that we talked about?
Innovation to make products that would give you.
In the case of intellectual property?
Yeah.
What about in some of the other cases we talked about? Like how about the illegal markets case?
I guess it would encourage things like sabotage or private violence against other companies.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good example of something problematic that can be encouraged by the existence of monopoly profits. Protection by the government can encourage lobbying, which can lead to, expenditures, maybe wasteful expenditures on lobbying, cozying up to politicians. Though it's not completely obvious that that's like the most terrible thing to encourage, because giving money to politicians might allow the people to pay them less. And if you think politicians are underpaid and we don't get like high quality enough people going into politics, that might actually be a good thing. Though maybe the types of people who are willing to accept money that way are not the types of people who want to be politicians. Additionally, sometimes companies, in order to lobby and get support from the government, don't just want to pay the politicians, but want to get support from the public, and they may do charitable things as a result of that. So, for example, AT&T had a monopoly for a long time. In order to maintain that monopoly, they did a lot of public relations work, a lot of which was driven through the research that they did at Bell Labs. And that research, I think, added a lot of Nobel Prizes came out of that. So that might be an important social benefit that was encouraged by their desire to maintain their monopoly. Private or illegal violence is usually very harmful, as we just discussed. Illegal cartels might encourage expenditures on illegally enforcing them, which might be wasteful. But mostly what they encourage is similar to what a merger would encourage, which could include diseconomies of scale, because firms might merge in order to exert their market power, even if they were more efficient operating separately. It might also encourage what's called entry for buyout. I think this was last year's problem set. But the idea is that firms might enter the industry, even though they don't have a better product, just so that they could get bought out by existing firms. If you make that illegal, if you make mergers between closely substitutable firms illegal, then that firm never would have entered, and that would have saved the money that it cost that firm to enter. So that's a potential problem that allowing mergers could encourage. Yeah, Philip.
If entry for buyout is so easy, wouldn't the prospect of entrance kind of deter the exertion of too much market power in the first place?
Yeah, but maybe you want market power to be exerted in the first place because the firm innovated in order to create a product, right? So you actually wanted the initial firm to have a lot of profits so that it could reward their innovation. So that's like a double reason why entry for buyout might be bad. it might be bad both because it's wasteful for the price of the entry, but also because you want the initial firm to do better. So like a good example of that is, so there's this policy that a lot of drug companies pay people who have developed competitors to their drugs to delay entering the market even after the patent has expired, because they want to have extra life on their patent effectively. And the Supreme Court ruled that illegal under the antitrust laws. But that might actually benefit the drug companies, because now there will be less incentive to develop an alternative generic just to get paid off by the drug companies. You see what I mean?
But if there is some sort of side payment that's possible that would actually deter the entry, it seems that might imply that it's more socially inefficient for one company to just produce. Because the new entrant needs to get a side payment at least as big.
Well, no, that's not true, because the thing is, like, it might lead to more profits, but that doesn't mean it's more ex post efficient.
That's true.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I looked
Yeah.
at the A and B, the informant thing.
Yeah, thanks,
There's this
Danny.
thing called lysine, which is an additive they add to animal feed,
Okay,
and it includes in high fructose corn syrup.
I see.
So
But is it like a vitamin type additive or
it's an amino
no?
acid.
What?
It's an amino acid.
But is it like to give micronutrients or?
I'm not sure.
It's nutrients for like cattle feed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is some form of vitamins, but it's vitamins in, like, you know, for cattle, not for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so intellectual property, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the lecture, has a lot of beneficial things that it encourages, and that's what we'll emphasize. But it can also encourage more costly things, like trying to get a patent just before somebody else is going to file for the same thing, just to beat them, which doesn't create any social value. It just brings the thing slightly forward and allows you to get the credit. So that's not such a beneficial thing that intellectual property encourages. Yeah, Christian?
Isn't that like very similar to the entry for buyout thing? Like if you just get patent trolls that have no intention of actually producing the product, but just want to be, either want to win a lawsuit or want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the racing dynamic is extremely similar to the entry for buyout type dynamic. You want to discourage copycat type stuff, especially if it's preempting the other person. That's also related to a lot of the things we talked about in financial markets that are problematic, right? Try to, like, you know, get the information just a minute sooner than you so that I can cash in. Okay, so Joseph Schumpeter emphasized these dynamics. He said that, you know, the most important part of capitalism is innovation and progress, and that the static distortions associated with monopoly are fairly small, whereas the creative power of capitalism, all the new things that it's invented, has really transformed the world. Now, I think you need to be a little bit careful about this because, of course, the long-run benefits, once you discount them, might not be quite as overwhelmingly large as it looks. But, you know, for the most part, I think that the innovation has been much more important, and any reduction in innovation probably would have made much bigger long-term difference than the small static distortions in the short term. And as a result, he said that the most important thing about capitalism to make it function well is to have a healthy competitive process. And how did he describe that competitive process? Wesley's not here. I think he dropped out of the class, right? Yeah, Wesley's. Does anyone else want to describe what Schumpeter said about competitive process? Yeah, Bart.
So it's like you're competing against time frames as well.
Yeah.
So against your future competitors, and pricing based on that competition as well.
Yeah, so he said that, you know, the biggest threat to a monopolist is not like that somebody else offers the same product for a cheaper price, but that someone else comes along with a product that's so much better that the monopolist that it's just not even a relevant product anymore, right? So the real goal should be to encourage this sort of creative destruction where people are constantly coming up with products that wipe away old industries. And that in order for companies to be able to afford the R&D that they need to do in order to do that type of creative destruction, it may actually require concentration. And that innovation is encouraged by the hope of getting at least temporary monopoly power. And therefore, the focus of industrial policy should really be on encouraging the creation of new products rather than on just minimizing these static distortions that are often the focus. At least have been the focus for us for the last few lectures. And I think the Schumpeterian competitive process resonates well with high-tech industries. Like, Facebook really didn't offer like a lower price, but swept away all the earlier generations of firms. Apple has repeatedly created products that have really revolutionized the industry, and it doesn't do it just by having incrementally higher quality or incrementally lower price, but when it's been really successful, by having a completely different product. Though recently, they haven't really been doing that. They've been doing these incremental innovations, which are, is something that people are afraid of in terms of Apple's prospects for the future. Google, similarly, has sort of busted open many different segments of the market. It was a latecomer, actually, to the search market, and then within a few years completely dominated it, and has brought, sort of revolutionized the maps part of the market, revolutionized email, many of these different areas, and mobile operating systems, etc. And so, there's a very dominant position that Google now has in the market as a result of this. But many people would say that no matter what problems that brings, they might not show links as accurately for rivals, etc. Those are really small relative to just like the way that Google's products have totally changed the way we interact with the internet. And that anything that would reduce the chance that we would have gotten Google is, even if it creates an incremental increase in the benefits we get out of Google, is probably not worth it. So that's sort of Schumpeter's concern. Yeah, Christian.
Well, sorry to interrupt the slide, but
yeah.
You said it resonates with high tech. Would it be fair to say that it resonates with all like fat-tailed industries, where you have an even greater drive to have that competitive process?
Yeah, I think that tech has been the area with like the largest amounts of innovation in recent years, but like medicine has not. Well, new medicines have, but like a lot of the process of the medical sector hasn't advanced that much. So, and car industry hasn't advanced that much in recent years. So I don't know that it resonates as much in those types of industries. It's called tech for a reason, right? It affects lots of different areas, but it's an industry that's dominated by like new types of technologies, right? Smartphones and apps are another example of this. At least a few years ago, I'm not sure this is true anymore, but like every 6 months, there were just like totally new types of smartphones out that totally wiped away the last generation. And this is, less clear, I think, in other industries. Even operating systems have not advanced that much over the last 20 years, for example. Okay. So I think to show the importance of dynamics compared to the static distortions, I think that a useful analogy is to crime. So most criminal activity, especially property crime, is committed by the poor against the rich. And a famous quote talking about this is the law in its majestic equality forbids the poor and the rich man equally from sleeping underneath a bridge or stealing a loaf of bread. As a result, most property crime is actually redistributive, and to a large extent entails little direct efficiency loss. It just transfers from one person to the other, and usually the person who's stealing needs the thing more than the person that they steal it from because of declining marginal utility of wealth. And thus, from a static perspective, crime should be legal, right? Crime is beneficial when you look at it from a static perspective, right? So I think this is sort of an absurd conclusion that forces you to examine the premises. And the key premise here was that we were only thinking about the static, short-term effects of crime, and not about what would be encouraged in the long term if criminal activity were not prevented. So one thing would be people would spend all their time stealing rather than working and being productive, which would undermine people's incentives to actually, produce things. People would spend a lot of money trying to prevent other people from stealing, which would be wasteful. And because people wouldn't be able to hold on to the fruits of their labor, that would probably lead to too much redistribution relative to the optimal level of redistribution, which we're going to talk about in the next class. Now, none of this shows up in a simple static analysis, and therefore, of course, we couldn't think about crime unless we thought about both these short-term benefits, maybe, but also the long-term costs of allowing crime. And Schumpeter would argue that this is true of industrial economics as well. If we spend all of our time thinking about these static distortions, right? If we think of all of our time thinking about whether enough of the good is being produced, we're not going to think about what's really important, which is the encouragement of innovations. There are other similarities, actually, between the analysis of crime and industrial organization. In particular, in crime, unlike in the Pigouvian context we talked about with externalities, we usually have to use punishment, which is costly to inflict, rather than fines, which are just a transfer. As a result, it's costly to deter crime. Similarly, in IP, we want to encourage innovation, but we do that by giving a patent which creates a deadweight loss. And so it's costly to incentivize innovation as well. And that means that there's a lot of similarities between the optimal amount of criminal justice enforcement, that it depends on how much people respond to enforcement. In the same way that we'll see optimal intellectual property depends on how much we think people respond by innovating. Okay. So there's a static dead weight loss harm created by intellectual property. It decreases the consumption of the good that there's intellectual property over. But Christian, what are some of the other harms that intellectual property might cause?
So like the dynamic harms, as we were talking about?
Well, so it could encourage the racing and so forth that we were talking about. But also, what are other things that you just think of when you think of problems with intellectual property or harms that it creates?
Well, there's all the litigation, especially you see in the high tech, between Samsung and Apple.
Yeah, so that's very wasteful, absolutely.
And then other things, well, like what you just flashed on this.
Yeah, so you can discourage follow-on innovations, right? So a lot of ideas, if they're patented, people then won't innovate based on them because they're afraid that they're going to have to pay so much to the initial patent holder that it's not worth it to them to innovate, right? Evan?
So couldn't the follow-on innovation thing also apply to the company that originally innovated? So suppose they have a patent, they might not be as interested in developing the next thing because they know that no one can use their product for 20 years.
Yeah, so they might actually want to commit to what's called an open license, because that will encourage other people to make those investments. Or they might commit to saying we're never going to charge more than a certain amount for licensing in order to encourage other people to develop things around it, because they think that in the long run that'll lead them to make more profits. So that's a good point. Litigation is costly and complex. You have to figure out whether a given application of an idea is covered by the patent. And companies often try to avoid a lot of these costs by striking deals about cross-licensing. Also, patents could reduce intrinsic incentives to innovate. Because people, if they have the opportunity to get a patent, might not want to share their ideas because they want to work on them until they get them to a point where they can patent them. The common public license in open source software is often used to deal with this issue. So you can, rather than patenting something, put it under an open license, which says that anyone can use it, but only if anything that they build is also under the open license. So that allows people to produce something without allowing it to become patented eventually, so that they can get whatever they produce adopted very widely, because that's often an intrinsic motivation that people have. It's like they want whatever software they develop and whatever gets built upon it to be available to a lot of people, so they get credit and so they feel that their thing is being used a lot. And that's becoming a growing part of software development. So here's a little bit of evidence. So Heidi Williams, who is a professor at MIT, had a very clever way of looking at the way in which patents can discourage follow-on innovations. In particular, she looked at the race to discover the human genome. I don't know if anyone followed that. You guys were probably pretty young when that was happening. But there were two groups that were doing this. One was Celera Genomics, which was a private company, and every gene they discovered they patented. And one was the government, and every gene that they discovered they put into the public domain. And because these genes were like quite similar, and you can find very comparable ones, you can look at were the ones that were discovered by the government or the ones discovered by Celera the source of more follow-on innovations. And she found that there was a significant difference. On average, there were about one less publication on the things that were discovered by Celera than by the government. There was about a fifth less known therapeutic innovations based on that, et cetera, et cetera. So it discouraged, the patenting by Celera discouraged follow-on innovations. Okay. Nonetheless, getting rewards to innovation is very important. Okay, so if in the best case, the entrepreneur gets all the profits associated with the innovation, but all the profits are not all of the social value, because when an innovation is created, it not just creates profits, but it also creates consumer surplus. And this is called the market maker externality. If someone creates a new market, they only capture part of the benefit associated with that market. Now, this can be lessened when there's price discrimination, but as we learned, price discrimination is almost always imperfect, and so it's very hard for an innovator to capture all the social value associated with their product. Now, price discrimination plays an important role in the pharmaceutical industry, and it also happens in patent licensing, because there's often negotiations over the price that will be paid. Yeah, Tanner?
If there was a way to really price discriminate,
yep,
would innovation still be beneficial for society? Because
they would have no external spillovers, but they would still be beneficial, right? Like the ability to innovate would still be beneficial. It would just all be captured by the people who did the innovation. It would make innovation, I mean, so that's a general thing to think about. All that it means when we say, oh, there's not enough of something, like something is socially beneficial at its spillovers, is that the person isn't capturing all the benefit. As soon as you make that person capture all the benefit, then it no longer has these spillover benefits. But that's actually a good thing in the sense that you'll get the right amount of the activity when that occurs. It's just like having a positive externality, right? Okay, so formal government protection can also be useful to discourage people from holding things as trade secrets. Because if they hold them as trade secrets, nobody else gets to see the way in which the idea works, and therefore other people are unable to build on that innovation, and therefore allowing formal rather than trade secret intellectual property protection can actually encourage innovation by allowing other people to at least see what the person was doing and build upon it. And that's one reason why governments have formal intellectual property protection is that otherwise they think there would be so many trade secrets and so much hiding that it would actually reduce the rate of innovation. Okay, so to look at the incentives that profits give to innovation, Eric Budish and co-authors in a recent paper looked at medical trials, in particular new medicines. And in order to get a new medicine approved, you have to put it through a rigorous process of FDA evaluation where you have to prove that it's actually beneficial. Now, the more people that die, the more frequently from your disease, the easier it is to prove that you're reducing the amount of the number of deaths. If you have something that's like an early stage cancer that eventually will kill people, but it takes a very long time to kill people, versus a late stage cancer, it's going to be much quicker to get the late stage cancer drug approved because you'll be able to more quickly prove that it was actually reducing deaths, right? So here is a little study about this. So metastatic cancers, people die from very quickly. Localized cancers, people take a lot longer to die from. And regional cancers, they die from an intermediate amount of time. And this shows, as a function of that, how many clinical trials there are on each of these types of drugs. And you find there's a lot more clinical trials on the metastatic ones because you get it to market more quickly, and therefore you earn more profits on it for two reasons. First, those profits are sooner, so they're not as discounted. And second, you have more of your patent life still left because you get your patent when you first file for the FDA trials, but then you have to wait for many years in order to actually start earning profits off of that, and that reduces the profits that take a long time to get through the FDA relative to things that get through quickly. Okay, so this creates a fundamental trade-off between incentives for innovation created by IP versus the ex post distortions created by IP. The more IP protection, the more dead weight loss we're going to have, but also the more IP protection, the more benefits we get out of innovations. And an important thing to realize is that when we have the first little bit of protection, imagine we elevate the price just a little bit above cost. That hardly causes any dead weight loss, because the dead weight loss triangle is a triangle, right? But it creates a significant amount of profits because that's a rectangle. On the other hand, as we get towards the monopolist's optimal price, we're hardly getting any more profits by raising price. But we're creating quite a lot of dead weight loss because the price is already pretty high. And so the optimal protection is always going to be partial. We're never going to want to go all the way to the monopoly optimum because we're hardly giving him any more benefits and getting a lot of dead weight loss for that. But we're not going to want to have no protection because we could get a lot of profits for only a little bit of dead weight loss. And so the question is, what amount of partial protection do we want to give? Well, it's going to depend on the trade-off between the cost and the benefit. So Bart, remind us of the costs of intellectual property.
Well, aside from like the dead weight loss.
So it creates a dead weight loss by elevating prices, right? And what were the other things we just mentioned?
So like discourages innovation.
Follow-on innovations, absolutely. And Tanner, what are the benefits of intellectual property again?
Incentivizes people to produce new products.
Yep, that's the main incentive, yeah. And also to disclose existing information rather than hold it as a trade secret, potentially. Okay, so I want to just focus on the distortion of consumption versus the incentives. So imagine that we have a bunch of innovations that could be created. And imagine they have no marginal cost of production because most ideas can be reproduced pretty cheaply. And that on average they have a demand function Q of P. And I'm going to just normalize this so that the quantity that's produced when the price is 0 is 1. And the quantity that people want to buy when the price is 0 is 1. And that they have a monopoly price of 1. And then the consumer surplus is the integral from whatever price is being charged to infinity of the quantity. That's the normal consumer surplus formula. Firms will earn a profit of P times Q, because there's no cost. And they're only going to innovate if that profit is high enough, because innovation is costly to produce. And Julian, what are some of the reasons why innovation is costly to produce?
Well, you have to do research and development, and it might not work. There's the probability that you actually produce the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So like whatever, even if research and development costs don't sound that large, like they're very uncertain whether the product is going to be developed and whether it's going to be profitable once it's developed. So you sort of have to divide those costs by the probability that they actually succeed, right? And so we're going to summarize that by there being a supply of innovations, S of pi. Okay, so the total welfare created when there's a certain number of innovations is going to be the producer benefits and the consumer benefits. And can somebody tell me what those two benefits are, what the formula for them are? Yeah, Julian, do you want to try? Or yeah, go for it.
It should just be the consumer surplus plus the profits, right?
Well, so this is the consumer surplus per product, but how many products are going to be created?
Oh, Q of P?
Well, no, it's the supply of the innovations, right? So it's S of pi times CS of P, right? And then you need the producer benefits, which we can get by integrating under the supply curve of innovations, right? From a profit of 0 to the profit that they're actually earning. Okay. Christian, could you come up and take the first order condition associated with this?
Yeah.
With respect to P.
Okay.
So P is like the price or the amount of intellectual property protection we're giving.
Do you want me to keep this up? Sure.
You can erase that. Is everyone okay with that stuff about the grades? Yeah.
It's okay, I don't think anyone wants to see it.
So we have I just want to make sure I get this right. So,
D pi.
Oh, yeah. First order condition is product roll and chain roll. So that's S prime of pi P times pi prime of P times consumer surplus P plus the other term of the product rule, which is S of pi P times consumer surplus prime P.
Good.
And then for your second term, that's S prime.
No, this Leibniz, remember? The Leibniz rule.
Oh. Wait.
So
Is that just
It's-
S of pi?
S of pi,
Time. Oh, then you have to do chain rule.
pi prime. Exactly. And that you set that equal to 0, right? Okay. Nicely done, Christian. Okay, so that's what Christian just wrote out. Okay, so let's drop all of the arguments of this, and then Julian, could you find some way to try to simplify this? Do you have any thoughts?
So we have pi prime times S prime of S prime of Can we drop the argument of S prime higher?
So both of these,
Okay, both of them are S, yeah.
yeah, both of them are S, so we can factor that out.
Okay. Right, so pi prime S prime plus S, the S prime CS plus S equals negative CS prime S.
Yep, so that's this, right? So we got pi prime times S prime times CS is equal to negative S times CS prime plus pi. Right. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so now notice that deadweight loss is equal to the maximum possible surplus, which is the consumer surplus, but there's no profits, but there's no costs when the price is 0, minus the consumer surplus and profits that we actually get. And so negative CS prime plus pi prime is deadweight loss prime. Right? Okay, so then how can we rewrite this expression, Tavish? Look up. Yeah. How can we use this here?
So pi prime.
Negative CS prime minus pi prime is equal to deadweight loss prime. Where is that useful in the formula up here?
On the second of the two terms.
Yeah. What can you replace here?
Well, you can replace
Yeah.
that with negative deadweight loss.
Yeah, and then it cancels with a negative, so you just get S times deadweight loss prime. Okay, so if you then divide through by the supply and multiply by pi, this becomes the elasticity of the supply of innovations here. And you get that the elasticity of supply of innovations times consumer surplus divided by profits is equal to the ratio of marginal deadweight loss to marginal consumer surplus. Sorry, it's not marginal consumer surplus, marginal profits. That's a mistake. It should be pi prime there. Okay, so this is the crucial formula, and here's it correctly written. The elasticity of supply of innovations times the ratio of consumer surplus to profits is equal to the ratio of marginal deadweight loss to marginal profits. Okay, so how do we think about that? So here's how much innovations respond to additional profits. Here's the ratio of how much external benefit they're giving to how much people are capturing. And here is how much social loss we have to give up to give an additional unit of profits to the firm. Right? Okay, so this means that IP protection should be greater under what circumstances, Christian?
Protection should be greater, so if the marginal costs of incentive are greater, right? Then
What do you mean by that? So we should give more intellectual property protection. This is a...
Oh, okay. So, we
Yeah.
should give more. We
Yeah.
should give more intellectual property protection to products that will have a greater positive externality.
Yeah, where there's more consumer surplus being generated.
Yeah, and then where the elasticity of innovation supply is high.
Yeah, absolutely. And where it's less costly in terms of deadweight loss to reward. For per unit of profit we give, the deadweight loss is smaller. Okay. It would be good to verify these basic intuitions, that the higher the elasticity is, the more protection should be given, and the more deadweight loss there is for unit of profit, the less would be optimal. Okay, so to do this, we need to tie down the demand form a little bit, and I'm going to use a very simple demand form. Remember that pass-through affects both the ratio of consumer surplus to profits, we talked about that, right? And also the ratio of deadweight loss to profits. The more curved demand is, the higher the pass-through, the more consumer surplus there should be for every unit of profits, but also the more deadweight loss there should be for every unit of profits. And a simple demand form that allows us to vary around the pass-through is called the constant pass-through class. This contains all the demand forms that you've seen so far and worked with in this class. It includes constant elasticity, linear demand, and exponential demand, and the form more generally is given by this. So notice that if rho is equal to 1/2, these cancel and this becomes linear demand, right? If we take a particular limit, then we get constant elasticity demand, and as rho goes to 1, we get exponential demand. Yeah, Tanner.
So this is demand for innovation?
Yeah, this is the Q function.
Q is demand for innovation.
It's the demand for a given product. So like when you create an innovation, a new market is created. This is the demand in that market. Yeah, Rishi.
When rho is half, that's saying that half the incidence is borne by the consumer and half by the producer, right?
This is under monopoly. So under monopoly, the incidence is rho over 1.
Oh.
So it's 1/2 would be borne by the consumer, and all would be borne also by the monopoly, because the thing is there's more than complete incidence, right?
The parallel for rho being 1.
Rho would be 1 would be that like they're equal amounts for the consumers. And if rho is above 1, but it also, so that makes the CS to pi ratio greater, but it also makes the deadweight loss to pi ratio greater. And we'll see that that second effect is actually bigger, I think. Okay, so CS in this form, you can just integrate up and it turns out to be this. Deadweight loss turns out to be this, etc. So you can just, everything is really easy to work with in this form. So in this, within this class, we can just write a little Mathematica code to figure out all these things. Many studies have estimated the elasticity of innovation supply. In high-tech industries, it appears to be about 0.5 to 1. But it tends to be higher in medical industry. So how do we figure this out? So what you try to look for is something that would increase the returns to innovation and look at how many more innovations you get. So I had a student who actually did this a few years ago at Harvard. What he did is he looked when Verizon announced that it would start having the iPhone rather than just AT&T having it, and he looked at how many more iPhone apps you got in the following months compared to what you would have gotten before that was announced. And he found that it increased significantly, and he related that to how much more profits they would have made, how much bigger the market got for iPhone apps. And he got an elasticity of about 0.8 or something like that. On the other hand, remember that we showed those different clinical trials and that things make different amounts of profits based on the horizon of how long it takes to get things approved. You can figure out how much profits difference that translates into, and therefore, read off of that graph how much the elasticity of innovation supply is there, and that turns out to be closer to about 3. So the elasticity of innovation supply in these areas where it's much more costly to innovate, like medicine compared to high tech, tend to be higher. Yeah, Bharat.
Is the reason for that higher elasticity of supply because of the cost of type 1 errors?
Well, I think the main reason is just it's very costly to innovate in medicine because you have to run these FDA trials, you have to raise capital, you have to do a whole bunch of experimentation, whereas in high tech it tends to be less costly to innovate and therefore less elastic. Okay, pass-through data is much harder. Remember the Einov paper we saw showed that pass-through might be infinite over some ranges at least. There's a nice paper by Basenko that looks at a lot of consumer products and how changes in their costs gets passed through at supermarkets, and they found pass-through was roughly between 0.5 and 2, and I'll use that range. Okay, so I just ran these things on Mathematica because we had all these formulas, right? We can just plug them in over here, right? And here's what you get. So first, I considered a pass-through of 1, and I raised the elasticity of innovation supply, and that led to an increase in the optimal level of IP protection. Right? On the other hand, pass-through, when I moved it from 0.5 to 1, sorry, from 0.5 to 2, you see that that increases both curves, but it actually reduces the amount of intellectual property protection because it turns out to increase the deadweight loss more than it increases the consumer surplus, at least in this case. Okay. So we get that the higher the deadweight loss to pi is, the lower the optimal protection. The higher the elasticity of supply is, the more the optimal protection. And therefore, if you look over the full range of the parameters that I was doing, basically IP protection ranges from about 0.45 up to about 0.65. Okay, so how can we relate this to practice? Kim, how might we try to align this degree of intellectual property protection with something we could actually measure about the current intellectual property regime that we have?
We can measure it by durational pattern, right?
By what?
Durational pattern.
Yeah, that's right. So how might we think about doing that? Well, one idea is that patent life in the US is about 20 years, right? We can think there's about 5% interest rate, right? Maybe that's, fairly common. That means that if I had a patent forever, that would basically be worth 20 years of having it this year, right? Because if you do the infinite sum with 0.5, it gives you 1 over 0.05, which is about 20, right, which is 20. On the other hand, if I have it for only the first 20 years, then that turns out to give me about 0.64 of what it would be if I had it forever. And so that says that US patent protection currently is roughly 64% of what it would be if you had infinite lived patents. And that says that US patent protection is maybe on the upper range of where we were looking at, but pretty close to the range that we were talking about, which is kind of interesting. But of course, we should try to take into account some of the other harms and benefits associated with patents, like the discouragement of follow-on innovation, as well as the benefits of disclosure, which could effectively raise the ratio of CS to pi. Yeah,
right,
Tim.
Like the optimal protection should be between 0.45 and 0.65.
Yeah.
What do those numbers mean exactly?
Well, it's like the fraction of full protection that you're getting.
So it's
Okay. So unlike US practice, however, probably patent life should differ by industry, right? Now, in practice, some of this may come from the fact, may actually occur because judges are more loath to enforce patent protection in high-tech areas than in medicine. And that might effectively create different patent protections. But this is much less developed than are the way that, in general, criminal enforcement responds to the elasticity. So we are much less likely to throw a young person into jail when they commit a crime than an older person because we don't think that they're thinking it through and therefore not responding as much to that enforcement. Similarly, intellectual property, there hasn't been as much thinking through the circumstances in which there's going to be likely to be higher elasticity of innovation supply or lower, and thinking about the enforcement of intellectual property laws depending on that. But in principle, we should want in industries with low elasticity and high deadweight loss to have less patent protection. And I think a lot of people think the tech sector is that way because it's less costly to develop things and it's so hard to keep track of who's infringing or not infringing that deadweight loss is likely to be high. Whereas in pharmaceutical sector, it's much more costly to develop and it's much easier to track whether someone's using the product or not. And as a result, probably the protection there should be higher. So a lot of people think there should be longer patent lives in pharmaceuticals, but shorter ones or weaker protection in high tech. Okay. So while this was sort of the most basic trade-off associated with intellectual property, there are many other tools to encourage innovation. So for example, you can give subsidies for research and development, and that's extensively embedded into a series of tax credits the National Science Foundation, other subsidies that the US government gives. There are also private subsidies for IP effectively coming through this stuff that I was saying about how AT&T had a research lab that they were funding, etc. Another thing you can do is you could try to avoid the deadweight loss of innovation while still giving the incentives by trying to give prizes for innovations or to buy out existing innovations. So for example, if there's a really valuable patent but there's a big distortion that's going on because of the patent protection, the government might offer to buy the patent from the company to put it into the public domain so people could produce it more freely. And historically, this was a really big thing. So Napoleon and the British government offered lots of prizes for innovations, and the X prizes are trying to do that as well. You can also give subsidies to people for purchasing innovative products. That increases the demand in the market and therefore increases the profits the firm will earn. This is a common argument for why we should subsidize people using like green technology. It's not just because it's beneficial to reduce carbon, but that you'll incentivize the creation of more green technologies that way. You can also think about whether patents should be broad or long. So we talked about patent length, but there's also an issue of how broad protection, how broadly your patent is interpreted, right? So that's another trade-off. There's also lots of requirements in order to get a patent. So in order to get a patent in the United States, you have to prove that your patent, that what you're proposing is novel, that nobody's done it before, that it's useful, it has some practical applicability, and that it's not obvious. Those are adjusting what those things mean and how they're interpreted can also impact patent protection. In some sense, this is a form of patent breadth that comes through the requirements of the code, but there's just genuine questions about how these should be interpreted. There's also issues about how profits get divided when there are sequential innovations. Like imagine I innovate something and then you do something that builds on that. How should our profits be split? How should the courts interpret how we should do a bargain about that? Yeah, right.
So a subsidy would be similar to like patents that vary in length by industry, right? Because
well, no, but they don't create dead weight loss. Subsidies don't create dead weight loss. They're like a transfer, right?
Okay.
So they're a bit different. Okay. So there are different trade-offs that are useful in thinking about each of these different tools of policy, not just the basic IP trade-off. So for example, when we give research or development subsidies and corporate, we could also adjust the corporate tax rate. The benefit of doing these is they might allow, lowering these might be to allow internalization of the consumer surplus that's created by the market, but on the other, by creating a new market, but on the other hand, it gives more money to people who run companies, right? So if you raise the corporate tax rate while giving subsidies for R&D, then you can sort of target specifically innovations and without redistributing too much to firms. So that's something that people often advocate. My job market paper, that's like the thing that you go around and present so that they try to offer you a job at a university, explored the trade-off between IP versus prizes. And the basic idea, and there's a famous quote from Adam Smith saying that that if the government tried to give out prizes for like the greatest things that were created in the world, it couldn't do nearly as good of a job as it would do if it just gave out patents and let the market determine how much people get rewarded. Because the thing is, you won't make money off of patent unless people actually want to use the thing, but you will make it if they do. And so the government might have a hard time figuring out how much things should be rewarded if it didn't have the market to tell it. And that's one reason why you might have IP over prizes, even though prizes avoid the deadweight loss. There's a trade-off between how long to make patents and how broad to make them. And one argument is that you might want to have them for a very, very long time, but very thin. Why? Because that allows you to minimize in each period the ratio of the deadweight loss to the profits. Because remember, initially the profits grow, and then eventually the deadweight loss is the main thing that's growing. There's also a bunch of issues about the division between sequential innovations. So often, if there's a bunch of innovations, they'll all get put in that are all important to some process. They build on top of one another. They'll often get put into a patent pool. And those pools will determine how the revenues are split. And that depends a lot on government regulations, on how the courts interpret things, and so forth. For example, there's now a big debate about what's called fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing, which is basically when there are a bunch of patents that all are relevant to something and you put them all into a package, people have to agree to charge only a reasonable rate. What that reasonable rate is something that the group determines together. And in principle, our analysis says that it should be targeted depending on how much elasticity there was to developing that innovation, how important it was that they get a big reward in order to encourage them to have created it in the first place. And the interpretation of the criteria are still largely an open question, and people are still trying to think about what are the right trade-offs to think about in terms of how much we should require it to be non-obvious or novel, etc. Yeah, Dick.
In regards to the second point with IP
Yeah.
prices,
Yeah.
isn't it possible to let the market decide what the patent is worth and then have the government buy it?
Yeah, so if you do that, though, the problem is that people might be incentivized to game that by like trying to make it look like there's a lot of demand in the first year, and then it doesn't turn out to actually be as good. Or there could be some products that are late bloomers, and other products that like have a bang and then peter off. And you wouldn't do a good job distinguishing between those if you did it that way. But of course, yeah, there should be some amount of that for sure. That could definitely improve, but there's still challenges in trying to figure it out. Okay, great guys. Thanks.